Hello and welcome to Cultural Economy in the Kitchen, the podcast from the Journal of Cultural Economy's editorial collective. I'm Professor Philip Roscoe, Professor of Management at the University of St Andrews Business School, and I'm co-editor-in-chief of the JCE.
And I'm Dr. Addie McGowan, Research Associate in Market Studies at the University of Salford's Business School and Reviews and Online Content Editor for the JCE.
Today is all about ghosts, the remnants of empire, and the stalking spectre of neoliberalism. We have vampires and zombies too, and a little bit of craft work, which turns out not to be as wholesome as it sounds. What's not to like? Well, in the eyes of our guests, nearly all of it.
So let's introduce them. Joining us today are three colleagues who take us to the special issue on Ghosts of Empire and a more contemporary paper on UK Indian relations to further the conversation. Dr. Clea Bourne, Dr. Paul Gilbert, and Dr. Eleanor Newbigin. Clea, can you please introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining us from today?
Yes, I'm Clea Bourne, and I'm a reader in media studies and market studies at Goldsmiths, University of London.
Nice. And can you tell us what you've been into cooking lately in your kitchen?
Yes, well, I kind of straddle because I'm media studies and market studies. I'm always working on at least two things at the same time. So I am about to start a project on financial lives of migrants here in the UK, focusing initially on the African and Caribbean communities. And I am also working on my next book, which is going to be about understanding the promotional industries at a conjunctural moment.
Well, now what about your actual food-oriented kitchen? What are you enjoying cooking lately? Are you straddling two things too?
Well, I haven't even made up my mind what's for dinner today. That is my life. So I usually consult with the other occupants and go, are we cooking or are you getting something? And it'll probably be spag bol.
Nice.
Paul, please introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining us from.
Hi, I'm Paul Gilbert. I'm a reader in development, justice and inequality at the University of Sussex, and I'm joining you from Brighton, just outside my kitchen.
And of course, the question, what are you cooking in the kitchen that you're just outside of?
In my actual kitchen, well, I still got sort of garlic and ginger in my hands because I've been making meatball mix, and depending on the mood of my children when I pick them up later, they're going to shape them into the meatballs. Either they'll be really into it or they'll be horrified, depending on the I don't know how the meat tastes.
Your keyboard will be will taste good for weeks afterwards, whatever happens. And Eleanor, the same. Introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Newbigin. I'm Senior Lecturer in the History of Modern South Asia. I have an interest in the political economy of sort of formal decolonization in South Asia, and more recently have been interested in the political economy of how this history is remembered, the political economy of heritage, particularly the heritage of the end of empire. And I am not in my kitchen. I'm in my office in SOAS in London. We moved house last week, so actually not being in my kitchen is quite a nice thing at the moment. And depending on quite how late I'll get home, I'll find out if I get dinner at all. So we'll see how it goes.
You're cooking cardboard boxes mostly. That's
right, for many months to come.
Nice. Well, and it's not fair that we just interrogate our guests, so it's time for us to interrogate Philip. Philip, can you tell us what you've been cooking lately and where you're joining us from?
Well, seeing as you ask, he sighs. I've cooked, I'm very upset about this. I've cooked a pasta and bean thing, and it's got an Italian name, but I'm not even going to dignify it with that because it's the most dismal creature. It's got cabbage in it, and it's faintly beige coloured and makes me sad when I look at it. But the more I eat of it, the more it expands. You put it back in the fridge and it grows. And I've just had some for my lunch. So I look forward to the Nobel Prize for solving world hunger, even if it's a pretty miserable process on that journey. Anyway, let's do some work. Clea and Paul, you compiled this special issue published, I hope you don't mind me saying, after a very long gestation in January 2024. And you called it Financial Capital and the Ghosts of Empire. It's part of a long-standing project concerning the ideological, technical, political and cultural roots of debt, financialization and capital. So tell us a bit more. Tell us about these core ideas and how they all fit together into your bigger projects.
Well, I could probably start because as a group, I think we probably got together starting with Professor John Montgomery, who is now relocated, I guess, back home to Vancouver, but she and I used to work together at Goldsmiths. And it actually got started with zombies, to tell you the truth. We were doing a lot of work on post-financial crisis considerations. Jonna has written about the zombie economy. We hosted a conference at Goldsmiths on beyond the zombie economy. And one of the things that we were discussing in the aftermath, especially considering some of the conversations we were having with members of the public through a financial reading group that we ran at Goldsmiths for many years, is how interesting it is what metaphors really resonate with people. And the zombie does it really well for experts, but actually ghosts are much more democratic. You know, everybody gets the metaphor of the ghost. So we wanted to push that further. And I think Jonna then moved on to bring Paul into the loop. And Paul may have been the one who then brought in Max.
I think so. It's nearly 10 years ago.
We don't quite remember our origin story.
I think I reviewed one of Max's books and then started chatting to him online. And then, so I think it might have been that way. And we then had, after those workshops that Clea and Jonna did at Goldsmiths, we then had a series of other workshops at Goldsmiths and Sussex. And I think one of the other things, apart from thinking through ghosts, was all of us in one way or another were coming at questions of, I guess, cultural economy of finance or social studies of finance in a way, in sort of settings where we thought that questions of colonialism, imperialism and race were very clearly implicated, but it seemed like we were going to sort of different conferences to talk about different halves of our interests. A lot of finance folks didn't want to talk about race and ghosts and empire, but cultural studies folks didn't always want to talk about the technicalities of finance. And so the four of us come from, I guess, at least 4 different disciplines. So sort of political economy, anthropology and development, cultural and media studies. I think Max also has an English literature background, possibly. Yeah. So all kinds of things getting stirred up. And we realized that, an interesting way to make these conversations happen was to sort of bring together artists and curators. We had museum sort of heritage folks at one of the workshops alongside political economists writing about finance, and having these really generative discussions that we couldn't find a space for before we start bringing those people together.
So we'll get back to the ghosts in a moment, because the ghosts are great, although I'm going to have to find out as well why zombies only do it for experts. But but tell us, if the real core basic ideas that underpin the issue and the introduction, tie them all together. These ideas about the roots of debt and capital and so forth in empire, in colonialism and so forth. Talk us through some of those key points.
Well, I think I used to find, talking to several colleagues, that having really relocated to Britain more than 20 years ago now, that many of these conversations seem to be either submerged or just invisible to people in a way that they weren't, from my sort of standpoint, having come from Jamaica, where these are things that we talk about every day because we can see them. They're very visible to us. The position of being indebted and being told that you're indebted as a nation because you don't pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you're not being productive enough. Conversations that inherently feel unequal, and yet no one's saying it. So I think for us, what these papers do in this particular special issue is make things visible, and things that are difficult for many groups of people to talk about or to acknowledge, because they are horrors in a way, they are traumas. They say things about ourselves as possibly fair and equal people that we do not want to acknowledge. And they bring them straight to the surface. And what we thought was really useful about the fluidity of the ghost as a metaphor is that the ghost can itself represent colonialism that is doing the haunting, but also the ghost can represent the people who effectively are being they feel the impact of colonialism, and they are standing up and they are haunting colonial powers in their own ways. So there are many different ways to think about the ghost, but also to think about how finance and colonial relationships may remain intact, but they shapeshift. So they shapeshift over time, and I think Kavita Dattani's paper really makes that point very, very well, that the state has always been about collecting information about its citizens and trying to make them visible in ways that are about money relations and financial relations and other forms of power. But the ways that the state does that and the partners with whom it collaborates will shapeshift over time. So she looks at ADAR as this huge data collecting machine that the state of India now runs, and traces that back to its colonial birthplace with just the fingerprint. India, one of the first places to collect a fingerprint and use it in the court. So that's just one example.
And these are ideological, technical, political, cultural roots of things that we take for granted are resoundingly tied to the logics of empire, and therefore I guess the logics of exploitation as well, because it's the characteristic of empire that it is profoundly exploitative, and that's difficult for people to talk about. And you say that we live in a world marked by willed forgetfulness. Who benefits from this forgetting? How's it institutionally reproduced?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because when I was rereading this earlier in preparation for this and thinking about what I've been talking to colleagues about recently, we have a small cluster within a research center here, the sort of reparations research cluster, that has a partnership with UE Mona in Jamaica, as Clea was mentioning, where things like colonial debts are not easily forgotten, right? And I think I'm not sure things are as under the surface or as they were. There's still a process of willed forgetting, but in a kind of overt way. If you think about people like Nigel Bigger and others who have made this industry around retelling a positive story of empire and sort of reworking the history of Britain only as the emancipator, that is kind of it brings things into the light while also doing this willed forgetting, right? And sort of, I think the ghost metaphor can travel into that, because one of the things we mention in the introduction, and particularly when talking about reparations, is that sort of the idea of haunting is a counter to the idea the past is settled, or the thing that wrongs need to stay in the past, or that wrongs are no longer wrong because they were in the past, right? And there's this huge push from a sort of conservative historiography part of these culture wars in the UK to try and keep things in the past and insist that then the wrongs not righted are fine now because they belong in the past, right? So the idea, the metaphor of the ghost allows you to then think both about what they're trying to do, which is ignore the ghosts, hide them, consign this sort of imperial past that still wounds in the present to a sort of forgotten past. But like Clea was saying, it's this plastic metaphor, because what they're doing is also haunted by these kind of desires for a resurgent empire, right? Even if they wouldn't.
There was something else we were also very keen to do in terms of cross-fertilization, and that was to dispel this notion that there is only one form of colonialism, only one form of imperialism. And I think, sociologists like Gurminda Bambra, that's something that she's been working on for several years, to trace the different pathways of colonialism. So a great deal of reading material that you can find in the English language will obviously focus on British colonialism, for example, but we also need to think about the position of the United States, which I think really brings us into the present, because we are seeing their kind of colonizing power in new and harsher ways than we've seen in quite some time. And then the paper by Emmanuel Guerrisoli and Santiago Mandarola looks at Iberian colonialism, which looks at the impact of that in Latin America, and then takes us into the present time, looking at the role of China as a colonial imperialist power in the modern day. And, you know, moving back to Kavita Dattani's paper, she thinks also about colonialism taking place from outside of a state, but also within a state, which what is the case in India. And I think there's also our artists that we got together. They bring in all sorts of other colonialisms in the round table that Max Hayden had hosted. And importantly, for example, the different kinds of colonialism that took place in Africa as a continent, the many forms of trauma from many sources of colonial power that happened there. And the ghost has been very useful as a metaphor to move around from these different kinds of colonialisms and different kinds of cultures.
Cool. So Eleanor, you're nodding away, and this is on your patch as well. I mean, we'll get to your specific paper in a little while, but would you like to join in on the ghosts and the traces of empire?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that connects your special issue and some of the things we're looking at is this problem of the past and how to sort of talk about it. And I say that as a historian who struggles, I mean, with issues around the discipline, not least because of the very kind of conservative public history. I mean, we've actually always had. It's just taken on a particular kind of dimension, I think, at the moment. And I mean, one of the things that I have sort of found extraordinary in doing sort of some public history work is that idea that if only the general public knew, you know, that there's an ignorance around this. And actually you find in the archive, this information has been in public circulation since these events happened. I mean, I've been looking particularly at the end of empire in South Asia, the huge violence around partition. News stories carried this. Mountbatten organized press conferences to avoid it. You know, this hasn't been, you know, as you say, this isn't so much a kind of a repression here, that actually there is active, there's an industry in forgetting this and in kind of repressing it. And I wondered, you talk in the special issue in the introduction about sort of ghost hunting and sort of seeing ghosts. And Paul, you've talked about that as well, about sort of using ghosts to reveal some of the dynamics of the project. But I wondered if you could say a bit more about what sort of showing the ghosts can do moving forward. You know, they're there, but what does revealing them help to do in terms of sort of challenging some of these structures?
You first, or me, Paul?
My brain is being slow, so if you've got something on the tip of your tongue, you can go first.
That's fine. Yeah, so I really liked, so the idea of ghost hunting as a method, I found in post-colonial work and you know, sort of crossover with cultural studies as well. And I found it really quite empowering to think about ghosts in that way, because I suppose from maybe a Western perspective, the ghost is often given kind of a negative aura, and that isn't the same in all cultures. Ghosts can be very positive. Ghosts can be things that walk along beside you and give you an advice on how to go through life and how to pick your loved one and how to look after family and all sorts of very wise things that a ghost can do. And I think it's also quite productive to think about the ghost in that way. So there are positive ghosts who are also quite powerful. They never lose their power or energy, really, and you can't kill a ghost. So there's that element. But also, thinking as researchers, I think we all use terms like we set out to unveil things or to uncover things. Yes, but then what do you do with it after? And with many forms of research, you might do it, put it away in a nice package and walk away. But with ghost hunting, what you're going to say is you're never going to let this go until there is change. You will stay there, even if it's very silently in the background, staring, making things extremely uncomfortable. So you were talking about the long gestation period of the project. And of course, we can never forget COVID, right? COVID happened right in the middle of this particular special issue. And it has to be said that there were people who were going to contribute who were impacted by that and were therefore unable to do so, but also people who were impacted in the changes that are happening in academia. We had one contributor who left academia, and that was why she didn't take part in the project. So there's all sorts of traumas that are happening along the way. But what we liked about it is that ghost hunting meant that even if, you know, myself and Max and Jonna and Paul are not necessarily doing anything quite actively at the moment, we will keep this hovering. I mean, this is a topic that I could return to really quite easily because there were so many other aspects of empire and finance capital that we weren't able to touch on in this special issue that I think are worth revisiting. So it gives you a reason to stay with something, knowing that you may not be doing something actively on it at the moment, but you can be there in the room hovering and waiting for your moment to haunt.
I really liked... Sorry.
No, go for it.
You go, Paul.
Okay, so I was just going to say, to pick up on what Clea was saying about, ghosts can walk alongside you. One of the there's a sort of line about this in the introduction that picks up on that, and I particularly like, where sort of you can think of ghosts as traces of possibilities not permitted to be real, right? And I think that's really important in the world we live in at all kinds of scales, right? Including the international. And one place that I have tried to, or I guess maybe not actually deliberately thinking of it as an extension of this project, but where it's sort of leaked into other things that I've been doing, is Sussex, for reasons of having a long-standing sort of development research institute here since it was set up in the 60s, has a whole bunch of stuff in the library basement that was collected all around the world in sort of moments of decolonization, and some of it bears traces of development as a sort of continuation of imperialism and sort of some fairly dark fertility control projects and so on. Some of it's dry technical sort of soil reports, which is thrilling to some, and then some of it is the sort of pamphlets and circulars produced by liberation movements, or a big run of the Tricontinental magazine produced by OSPAL in Cuba, or sort of runs of academic journals that ceased publication before or during the period in which structural adjustment in the African continent meant that a lot of higher education was defunded, right? And then they were never digitized. And so with some of my students and with Danny Millam, a special collections librarian, we've been doing a bunch of work for the last couple of years, just getting people to engage with that material, to look at what possibility looked like in these resources that, one of the things we stress is like, these are sort of ghosts in the basement of the library in a way, because I think a lot of our students think you can find loads of stuff online, right? And you can, but not everything's digitized. Right. Not everything's been harvested by various LLMs as part of their training. And there's a huge amount of these traces of possibilities that were never allowed to become real, but you can kind of walk alongside them and look for inspiration and hope and learn lessons from them in that sort of good haunting way, sort of friendly ghosts way.
I think that was a big part of the message in Ashley Cordis's article about Mazzocoin and indigenous peoples in the United States, because Mazzocoin, she points out that for the founders, this was an experiment. So it didn't necessarily achieve an objective of becoming the currency for a particular indigenous people on their reservation, but it showed a potential for how people could come together. And what she argues in her article is even arguably what might be seen as a failure of this particular cryptocurrency. The fact that it's still there, its codes keeps being updated, etc., allows it to haunt, and images and descriptions that are tied into the code keep popping up whenever the crypto market actually rises, which I just think is like one of the best haunting messages ever, So you may not have become a living form of US currency, but you're never going to let them forget. I love that.
A ghost in the machine.
In the machine, quite literally, yes.
Yeah, I love it. I think one final thing we want to ask, and then we'll move on to Eleanor, but we found the theoretical background of ghosts is so interesting. So, from Derrida, where do they come from? Is this ultimately a Marxist notion? Just invite you both to speak about that.
And why was Marx so obsessed with spectrality, And I think, Derrida, there are other writers who have talked about this, but I think part of that is recognizing that there is a seam of what it's like to be a researcher and academic that maybe isn't as accepted in the modern kind of academic structure, whether you work in a university or whether you work outside of a university. And that might be because of the neoliberal pressures that researchers are under these days. But, being a bit into mysticism or in other ways of doing things was obviously far more cool. And maybe this was also because, there was a time when most academics were white men and whatever they did was okay. And maybe if the rest of us tried it, it wouldn't be so okay. But I liked that form of experimental thinking that they engaged in. I'm not going to venture into territory as to whether they had any help from external things that they may have imbibed or ingested.
Or just got at the Ouija board.
Yeah.
I think
automatically.
Clea or possibly Max, someone put it in the introduction about thinking through ghosts allows you to think about finance and empire in a way that's at once visceral and rational, crossing that.
I like the fact that you haven't, I don't think you used it at all, but you certainly didn't use it heavily. You never used the term hauntology or ontology or however you're supposed to.
It is in there, but it's not our choice of words. So it does come from.
I know, because I always think that's the sort of that's the white male philosopher kind of grabbing the ghost and making it somehow containable as a bit of critical theory. So the introduction was written. It was all written under the shadow of the pandemic. That's very clear in the introduction. But we have moved on, and there are now there are other shadows, the other ghosts. What might the return of the repressed, as you so nicely put it, refer to in our current moment?
Well, there's a few things that I've been thinking about, and certainly in terms of Eleanor's paper for JC, just thinking about the creative industries and what is happening with artificial intelligence. For me, that is one of the biggest forms of haunting happening today. And generally speaking, if you think about the tech sector, writing from my position in media, communications and cultural studies, and just looking at how many aspects of the global economy are effectively being captured. That's a chosen word that you might use in markets, but really, I think more appropriately, the word is colonized by the tech sector. And the creative industries are a very good example of this. So in the UK, where I'm based, there is a particular definition of the creative industries that was already colonized by the tech sector a couple of decades ago, because they are considered to be part of the creative industries in the United Kingdom, which means that they have the monopoly on lobbying government and other forms of finance for everything that they want. And this is exactly what we saw happen with generative AI and large language models effectively being able to go in and scrape up content from all sorts of creative sources, whether that's literary, visual art, games, etc. So I think you can think about the ghost in a number of ways. First of all, you're seeing great power by the tech sector, particularly AI companies, colonizing creative work. And you can think about ghosts, first of all, in terms of the traces that are coming through. If you put a prompt into an AI tool and you get back a fantastic looking visual, there are ghosts in that visual of the work that has been produced by many creative people who have not been compensated for that work. So that's a very important part of the economy that anybody writing about finance needs to be thinking about. And the second way that we can think about ghosts in terms of this particular very rapid evolution in the global economy is to think about the ghosts of the Luddites. They've been invoked by several writers. And they're applicable because, the Luddites often get a bad rap. They weren't against technology. Many of them had actually contributed to designing the very forms of technology that then were being used by producers to take work away from them. And I think we see that again happening with the tech sector and the real creatives in the creative industries. So that's just one. I don't know if Paul wants to add another one because I got heaps.
I think that the Luddite thing is really significant. I'm also a fan of sort of talking to my students about recovering a different understanding. Luddite's always been like an insult for people who are incompetent or don't know how to use email or whatever. Is it sort of Jathan Sadowski and some others have written about the sort of the need for, alongside insider technical knowledge, the Luddite understanding of what technical innovations due to sort of wider socio-technical arrangements and social orders because of those innovations, that is what Luddite knowledge is, right? It's a recognition that this machine is going to change our world, change our families, change our social reproduction. And yeah, that's something to be valued. So if they can haunt us, that's great. I think there's other like hauntings, talking about empire and race, that in the same way that Clea talked about the positive side of ghosts and the sort of refusal to allow debts never paid to be treated as if they're settled, right? There's also the fact that you can't really ever trust the ghosts of imperialist ambition to stay in the past either, right? The sort of horribly named Don Rowe doctrine, the sort of like resurgence of these past imperialist doctrines that are now kind of back because they never really went away, and then it's possible to sort of trace another lineage where they were always there, sort of speaking in people's ears, and now they're front and center and people believe in them again. And then the final thing I'd say, and then I'll leave you to talk to Eleanor, because I think it might relate to what is in her paper about this kind of nationalist history and sort of neoliberalization of cultural industries that is happening in India. Is there are also hauntings occurring in former colonies that are violent and authoritarian, but and sort of majoritarian, and sometimes taking on the language of decolonization or anti-colonization, but are actually producing new forms of sort of majoritarian violence, right? Like the co-optation of the language of anti-colonialism or decolonialism and reparation by the Hindu far right in India, right? That is another haunting that is showing itself in the present in a way that would complicate and any kind of simplistic relationship between the imperial past and the former colony.
Yeah. And I think that's a really nice segue into Eleanor talking about your paper and even bringing it up to the most recent JCE issue. So this isn't the first issue in 2026. So it really nicely brings us to today. Your paper is called Assembling UK-India Relations Through Cultural and Creative Industries. So, although it's not in the special issue we've been talking about, it brings us to today, as we said, and it kind of takes another kind of neocolonialism lens to what's going on. One of industries are seen as this mechanism through which developing nations, so to speak, can develop. So Eleanor, you suggest that this is a common policy framing, and the acronym CCI for Cultural and Creative Industries points at this as well. So can you just introduce this for our listeners and for us and expand on this a little bit?
Sure. So, the paper is a joint piece written with my colleague Navtej Purawal, and we've both been working with sort of heritage projects at the moment, particularly kind of across the South Asian diaspora in the UK and India. And Tej in particular has a long history of sort of doing work across diasporas, focusing particularly on cultural production and on ideas around sort of development. And what we have seen within our own projects, particularly around, funding policy at the moment, is this turn to CCIs as being one of the main packages within which a whole bundle of different interests seem to be put together. And we became very interested in how this term has come to be so dominant. And I think when we were looking into it, neither of us come from within a sort of a more, Tej is a political sociologist, I'm a historian, and lots of the literature we found around cultural and creative industries was very much about sort of definition, trying to pin this term down. And actually what we found is that the ongoing dispute about what this term meant, that was what was interesting to us, that so many different people could invoke so many different things around this term. And it has lots of different lineages, down to birth of cultural studies in the 1950s, people cite Stuart Hall on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's a lot of really kind of, Thatcherite entrepreneurial moves that come in the 1980s. This gets remade in the new Labour policy. And so rather than engaging with this project of defining the term, we were interested in how it's being used more broadly, how this term that seems to have this history based in the global north is now being moved into the global south. And one of the things we saw there is that shift has really involved a move from focusing on creative economy to a language of cultural industry, which I think is significant. At a point in the paper, we talk about how UNCTAD forms of measurement enable CCIs to become a development package, so that economies such as India, where agriculture has remained such a kind of key part of the economy, the CCI package enables India to effectively sort of jump into the tertiary sector through its service industry. But in focusing on industry, actually that removes the web. Economy is a term that enables us to see how these multiple forms of culture are embedded in households, communities, social relationships. And so that move away to industries sort of financializes a whole set of much more complicated relationships, at the same time as the term cultural is still mobilized in ways that seem to speak to global development, sustainability indexes. It's about sort of social uplift. And so we use this form assemblages not to pin down a way of kind of thinking about how these terms are used, but actually to think about how the unfixed nature of these terms is doing a great deal of work. And I guess sort of in a way that I think might be akin to the ghost hunting, we wanted to sort of emphasize viewing. So rather than saying, is this cultural industries or not, we wanted to pose a set of questions. What is this term doing? What ideas of heritage and what kind of futures are being proposed through the way that this category is used? So again, I think that idea of sort of drawing things into the light a little more, not sort of simply putting things in boxes, not accepting ontologies or even accepting a single set of ontologies, but actually asking what the mobilization of certain terms does in this present juncture was what we really wanted to do in the paper.
Nice. Yeah, and I guess with assemblages, what do assemblages do, as you were just talking about? And you argue that CCIs have that ideological function and subsume history into future-focused economic plans and strategic resources. And I think you just touched on, we were going to ask, do you think there are ghosts in CCI? But I feel like you just mentioned ghost hunting and yeah.
I think there are ghosts, but I mean, again, maybe as a historian, one of the things that appeals around, I think particularly the kind of the Harrison piece, is that idea about heritage as not as the past, but as assembling ideas of the future. There's a futurity of heritage that I think we really wanted to sort of grapple with. And so, I mean, I think there's ideas of the past that I'd like to separate from the discipline of history and that practice of sort of composing linear origin narratives.
I was really struck reading the paper on it's just a throwaway paragraph. There's such a lot in the paper, but talking about the UK context and the use of museums, museums of industrial Britain and all of this kind of thing, which simultaneously takes attention away from the fact that Britain was a colonial nation and focuses on it as a factory nation, and also somehow gets tied to kind of cool Britannia and all of those ideas in a very future focused sort of way. So the affect and the nostalgia of working class reconstructions in city museums or whatever somehow says something about how our nation is positioned going forward, which is a fascinating observation.
But maybe there's also there's a ghostliness there too, because I think, in engaging with this literature, because on the one hand, there is a way in which kind of creative economy, cultural heritage can be used very enablingly. And, and I think kind of Harrison's article is actually very optimistic. It's kind of thinking about how heritage provides a space that other ontologies can come forward. We can rethink, humans' relationship with this sort of natural world. It's a request to kind of make a more plural version of heritage. And I think what's been interesting about the kind of, I guess, the last sort of 10 years is that the CCI agenda has both opened up opportunities for different kinds of critical introspection in the past. You know, I mean, I think Arnold's discussion of kind of memory museums, there's been a desire to break away from the authoritative narrative of museums, to create more experiential kind of museums, to bring in plural voices, more sort of social history. But that's always been contained by the financial structures that are also imposed on museums. You know, museums have been asked to speak to broader audiences, but to do so through a model that requires positive ticket sales, that has a kind of consumer satisfaction element to it. So the processes I think we're mapping seem to offer possible futures that feel somewhat optimistic, at the same time as being bound up with structures that kind of close them down. So there's an ongoing process of kind of constant foreclosing of ideas of what kind of thinking with culture can do. That's very enticing. I mean, I guess my question about sort of what do you do after seeing ghosts is as much a plea as it is a kind of intellectual question, in that I feel we spent a lot of time trying to map out what's going on here. And I don't necessarily feel all the more optimistic about what we can do, though we can see it. That actually the kinds of tensions we're identifying almost feel more kind of, you know, I feel quite constrained in thinking about what are the ways forward. You know, yes, there are potentials here, but one needs to care for them so carefully and put them forward, resist so many other structures that are pushing against them. It's not been the process of sort of forward-moving, optimistic work I guess I had naively hoped for at the beginning of the project.
Maybe that means you're onto something. Yeah, so I guess to bring it back to the Indian context, and then unfortunately we're having such a great conversation, we need to wrap up soon. But I wanted to ask you a bit about, you say you bring it to craft and the idea of craft within the Indian context, which I think with CCI and craft, that brings its own colonial assumptions, I think, to the table within this framing anyway. But, you know, crafts being tied to those development agendas, and you say they're, quote, a livelihood based on primary sector associated with economic and social marginality. Traditional crafts are a means to alleviate poverty and create safety net employment. But you also say that about how these neoliberal solutions pretty much ignore, and I think you were touching on this earlier, deeply colonial era structures of caste and gender and religion, ordering and discriminations within that. So can you say a little bit about that, you know, within the Indian context? Yeah.
So, I mean, I think actually this connects to a point that Clea was making earlier, in that actually, you know, there are important projects in the heritage sector that are showing that marginalized communities, you know, rather than just sort of being viewed through a deficit model and needing uplift, these are communities that hold knowledge about how to live more sustainably with the world, about how to ensure that livelihoods or practices that are now very much under threat can be maintained, how to sort of access water in certain contexts, or, you know, using materials more sustainably. And this is sort of one of the promises that the CCI seem to hold out. And yet the framework through which this category is being deployed in the current context tends to put a premium on the tech sector in particular. So projects might focus on marginalized knowledge, but seek to capture that in ways that can be marketized, you know, or tap into them with sort of forms of technology where the intellectual property right for this material is not being kept with the community, but moves forward to the platform that can help to kind of move it forward. So, I mean, I think it's particularly apparent within the textile industry in South Asia. There's been, you know, one of the big sort of success stories of CCI in the Indian context has been online platforms that enable small producers to sell their produce to global markets. And that has been transformative for some of the, you know, communities involved. But we need to ask who is, you know, where that wealth is being distributed, particularly intellectual property. Who does that sit with? So, I mean, I think that there is real promise in these categories, but the wider financial structures that they're being mobilized around, the kind of particularly UK-India government policy at the moment, is not foregrounding community interests and community well-being. There's a much more kind of a very different set of interests that are prioritized.
Thank you, Eleanor. That's fantastic. So it's interesting because you say in your paper, you argue the CCI policy agenda is ideological and strategic, and it has you make these ties between the sort of hard logics of defence and technology and so forth, and the softer power of culture and all of those kind of ideas, but actually, when we're talking to you, you're giving us a much more positive take, if you like, on the possibilities of creative work in various different kind of ways. And this sort of takes us back to the notion of the haunting, if you like, and the ghosts of empire. So let's just all of us together. Can we chase ghosts here? If ghosts are healing, Clea, as you say, there might be. Are there possibilities for our uncertain contemporary political moment in this regard?
Well, uncertain's kind of a soft term for what's happening in current geopolitics, isn't it?
Yeah, it is pretty certain, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, in a sense, this is a reaction to the certainty is a reassertion of all the willed blindness that you're talking about.
Yes. So I mean, I'm seeing two tracks at the same time. First of all, to me, there's many people who are still, just actively getting up every morning and refusing to see what is happening. But also, I think more encouraging for me is that, having been a lifelong cynic, there's so many more people who are now opening their eyes to seeing what kinds of colonial structures exist. So, very, very small things can happen. For example, I'm going to use the United States because there's stuff happening all day, every day there. Attempts to remove signs of slavery from a particular kind of museum, as a location, really does tend to stir up attention and emotion very quickly because it can happen so quickly. I think that is something that many of us as citizens around the world are realizing, that gains that were accomplished over maybe decades or centuries can be removed in an instant. And that when you see that happening, you have to say something right now. So if you're occupying the position of the ghost who needs to heal, you need to go do your hunting right now. But also, from the other perspective, you're actually seeing the ghost becomes larger in size and far more menacing, so far more visible than when they were sort of maybe hiding behind the curtains or up in the loft. So I am encouraged that more people are seeing. And I think as someone who's been researching finance from a communicative perspective, that has always been my goal anyway, is to make things more visible and to help more people to see.
Fantastic. Paul?
So I just one thing listening to Eleanor, and I guess it's okay, maybe similar to what Clea is saying, but like to take it back to this discussion Clea launched about AI, and Eleanor saying that a lot of the sort of prospects for what to do with cultural and creative industries is located around sort of tech that might have these extractive and concentrated forms of ownership. I do think there is something very curtailing of the imagination around a certain model of innovation rooted in a certain kind of tech sector. And I think you can see it creeping not just into the CCIs and so on, but if you look at what research funding is out there at the moment, what my current work is, well, a lot of my work's on aid funding and climate finance. And again, it's all looking for how can you make AI work for this? How can you make AI work for that? How can you make AI work for weather prediction, for climate smart agriculture? And where I would also look for hope is in these kind of hauntings that again come from other models that refuse to stay in the past, right? The fact that the best idea you can come up with to deal with like agricultural inequality is some kind of AI driven agriculture, rather than thinking about global trade regimes and land reform, structural changes. And it's not like these are new ideas, they're just ideas that are buried, but not fully buried, because there are plenty of social movements, civil society organizations around the world who have been keeping those alive, right? It's just maybe we don't see them as well. And I think a lot of those movements are yeah, people are realizing the extreme value of keeping alive those other visions of possible economic futures because of how constrained this present tech innovation imaginary has become.
It's become, and haunting is a very nice way to describe that kind of persistence. Eleanor.
I mean, I think I would agree with that. I mean, I think the shiftiness of I mean, I'm not sure that the category of CCI is salvageable or can be used constructively, but the shiftiness of the ideas behind it certainly can be. And I mean, I think along with kind of Clea and Paul, it is important to remember that these things are not fixed, and that assembling different futures from some of the kind of material around us that does not repeat the AI tech world. I would, absolutely agree that that's the sort of the way forward and the struggle that we have to focus on. I think, Clea, your point about kind of urgency in that, that so many things that have felt secure can be undone so quickly. There's no time to wait. Insisting on different accounts and tracing different pasts to enable different kinds of presence, I think, and futures is important.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a fantastic place to end. And I wish we could continue talking, but you've all been wonderful guests, and it's just been a fascinating conversation. So that's all we have time for, unfortunately. So thank you again to our guests, Clea Bourne, Paul Gilbert, and Eleanor Newbigin. You've shared some amazing insights into pasts, plural, presents, plural, and ghosts of empire. So thank you so much.
You've been listening to, or maybe watching, Cultural Economy in the Kitchen from the Journal of Cultural Economy Editorial Collective. Today's episode was produced by C-Ross Cinematics. You'll find links to the papers at the end of the video if you're watching on YouTube. Don't forget to like and subscribe, tell your friends, and share.
And don't forget to join us next time. Until then, we'll be raking through the embers of empire on our ghostly academic barbecue. Thanks for that, Philip. Take care, everyone.